Is NHS dental care affordable? Could Ukraine run out of money to fight Putin? And is the government's childcare plan in trouble? This is Politics Live. On the panel today, Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood, Labour MP Rebecca Long-Bailey, broadcaster and former Labour advisor Aisha Hazarika, and Conservative commentator Albi Amankona. Today, can the government solve the dental crisis?
We will be delivering up to 2.5 million more dental NHS appointments over the coming years.
The longer the Conservatives are in power, whether it's dentistry or GPs or operations, the longer patients will wait.
Will Donald Trump's supporters block military aid for Ukraine?
For those Republicans in Congress who think they can oppose funding for Ukraine and not be held accountable, history is watching.
And as the government promises to extend its free childcare offer, why are some nurseries struggling? We'll ask one provider why money's so tight. All that and Prime Minister's questions live at noon. Welcome. Let's start with this headline in BBC News because there is a battle over the nation's teeth. Dentists to get a £20,000 incentive as part of plan to combat NHS shortfalls. Under the new plan, dentists will be offered a bonus to set up practices in areas of England with the poorest access to NHS care. A BBC investigation in 2022 found 9 in 10, 90% of NHS dental practices across the UK were not accepting new adult patients for treatment on the NHS. Perhaps that's why, as you can see here, hundreds of people were filmed queuing around the block outside a dental practice in Bristol to try and secure a place. Quite extraordinary, really. But my question to the politicians to start with, Tobias, is should you just come clean about the fact the idea of people, everyone, securing an NHS dentist is for the birds?
No, I don't agree with that. I think it's something that any government would like to make a commitment to say you should be able to access a dentist, and those queues there are totally unacceptable. But in your introduction, where you spelled out most of the cases, the big challenge has been from COVID because the original traditional construct, if you like, broke after that. People didn't return back to their dentistries. We don't have enough dentists as well. There's also something wrong between the private sector and indeed the state sector. We pay for dentists to be...
But it's that contract that hasn't worked, has it?
If I can finish.
Well,
that's what's tucked in the announcements today is also to fix that, perhaps to oblige dentists that are trained for by the state to then stay committed to working in the state sector before they move to the private sector.
How long have you had to do that?
Sorry?
How long have you had to do that since this wrangling over the contract?
Well, it's more to do with because of COVID, because of that disrupted completely. We couldn't access dentists because of infections and things like that. And clearly the old model, as I was saying, is no longer working, which is why you've got these huge incentives to encourage dentists to stay on, to expand their work.
Sure.
But the critical question I make, and I stress, is why are we paying for dentists to be trained by the state to then go straight to the private sector? That needs to change.
Right, well, you've had a long time to change it. And they complain, of course, that the contracts are unfair and they don't make enough money to do that NHS work. But the same problem will exist for a Labour government if it comes in. Should you just be more honest? You've got plans to have kids' teeth brushed in school and so on and so forth. But in the end, the idea, when you just look at that one example of people getting an NHS dentist, it's just a myth.
It's not a myth. It's been chronically underfunded for nearly 15 years.
Oh, so you're going to put a lot more money into it?
Exactly, and provide incentives to train new dentists, put out an urgent programme to provide immediate appointments, and then there's a longer-term plan to reform the dental contract because, as you say, it just isn't financially viable for many dentists to provide NHS services. But the fact is, at the moment, we've got huge parts of the country that are dental deserts. It's so bad and so unaffordable for people to access private dentistry that people are resorting to pulling out their teeth with pliers. That's how acute this crisis is and how urgent it is to solve it.
How's it come to this? I mean, is it going to be a big political issue at the election now? Teeth?
Well, I think what it does do, it it provides another really powerful optic about this narrative of broken Britain. That's what it does. It's like it's another thing which adds to a list of things in terms of not being able to get an appointment to see your GP. You know, there are problems all across the country. We can't get our infrastructure done. And now on a really, really basic level, I mean, the sight of those people queuing up at that dentist and zoning into like older people who brought little chairs with them to sit, like because the queues were so long, people having their dentures in that, you just thought, this is like something out of Victorian Britain. What is going wrong? And the other thing is, a lot of people will see this and think, oh, this is just a health issue. It's not. We've got both parties talking about the economy. You cannot have a growing economy without a healthy workforce. So health and wealth are intrinsically linked. If we don't sort out our public services, if we don't sort out health service, if we don't sort out people's health, we're talking about teeth. There's another story which is not growing lists of mental health, particularly for young people. If we don't get this fixed, we are not going to grow our economy.
Those images are extremely compelling, aren't they? Whichever side of the argument you are on, just watching those queues for something that most people would assume is basic and fundamental, having your teeth checked.
It's shameful. I mean, it's unbelievable that in modern-day Britain we're seeing queues outside of dentists. I know at my local dentist, whenever I go and sit in the waiting room, the phone is ringing with people looking to be registered with an NHS dentist, and they say they are not accepting new NHS patients at all. And that's just not good enough. But I do just want to come back on this point about dental deserts, because that seems to be where the focus is on today. But if 9 in 10 dental practices aren't taking on new NHS dentists, is it really just dental deserts that need to be tackled here? That indicates to me there's a problem in 90% of the country.
All right, we're going...
Just to add to that.
Briefly.
Absolutely right to say that there are places across Britain that are worse affected. This is why we're having mobile dental units come in. Not a long-term solution, I agree, absolutely, but it will help in the short term because to affect those areas that are particularly badly hit.
All right, let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian. You were talking about the health and wealth of the nation. Aisha Starmer unwavering over Labour Green Pledge, despite claims party dropping it. Labour leader says £28 billion, how many times have we heard that figure, green investment desperately needed after sources said last week Labour were planning to ditch the policy. Yes, this is what's become something of a saga. Exactly what is happening with Labour's £28 billion green prosperity plan? It is the pledge to spend borrowed money on green projects and, in the party's words, turn the UK into a growth superpower. Well, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was clear in using that figure in an interview with Times Radio yesterday and saying it's very, very important, in contrast to other members of his top team who've been reluctant to use it. Let's have a listen.
We're going to need investment. That's where the 28 billion comes in, that investment that's desperately needed for that mission.
Doesn't that make the £28 billion you thought was a pledge and now a vague ambition, make that totally unaffordable? And isn't it time you were honest about it?
Well, I've always been really clear, Simon, that all of our policies are subject to our fiscal rules.
Is it a pledge or is it not a pledge? Can you use the word pledge?
The pledge is for public investment. The overall amount of spending is determined by our fiscal rules.
Rebecca, as a Labour MP, what is the policy?
For the 28 billion, well, it's to provide 28 billion during the course of the Parliament to invest that in green industry and green infrastructure. And if you're serious about growth, you have to be serious about investment in infrastructure because that catalyses private investment. It provides long-term certainty for business.
So why Rachel Reeves and Johnny Reynolds, shadow business and shadow chancellor, why couldn't they make it a pledge, repeat the pledge and say 28 billion
They've got to be very careful in what they say. And when they're spending that 28 billion during the course of a Parliament, they will have to very carefully provide evidence to Parliament and the Labour Party that those investment decisions are strategic and that they will provide an economic return for the country, either through future jobs, regional investment or future tax returns to the Exchequer.
But it's made everyone think it's not happening. You can see why, just looking at those two examples.
Keir's been very clear that it is happening and it's important that it does.
Right. I mean, it was announced in 2021, Aisha, just to give us a little bit of history, as an additional £28 billion funded by borrowing. Then it became minus the money the government is already spending on green projects, around £10 billion, so therefore only around £18 billion of new money. Then, as we've just heard from Rebecca, ramping that up, to use the expression by Labour, to £28 billion by about 2027. Now, we're not sure if the £28 billion figure is in doubt, although it's been restated by Keir Starmer. Is this confusion helpful to Labour's election strategy?
I don't think Labour is going to win or lose the election on this figure of £28 billion.
But the confusion
I don't think Labour's going to lose the election because of a confusion on this, to be absolutely honest. And look, we're still a long way off with the election. We've just been talking about the state of broken Britain. But what I think what Labour strategists will admit is that they maybe regret pinning a number on it so early when there was so many things moving. And of course, since then, lots of things have changed, including, Liz Truss and the mini budget. But I think what the Labour Party has got to do is just stay strong on this commitment. Interestingly, when I speak to business, and I do quite a lot of work with businesses, a lot in terms of green manufacturing, which is very much a growth business, and people see that as a business of the future. They are not at all bothered about this kind of row about the number, because they feel that this is a really good policy and they know that more money is going to come in because it's happening in America. Biden has done a huge thing with his Inflation Reduction Act. The EU is mimicking this at all. So if you want to say you're going to have a growing economy and you want to invest in jobs in the future, you are going to have to invest a lot of money. Maybe it might be 26 billion in the end. The other thing as well, which a lot of people, in terms of actually delivering this money, you have to work with business to pay the money. So I think what Labour's got to do is not be scared of the Tory attack line. The Tory attack lines are saying this is going to be £28 billion of terrible funding. I think Labour shouldn't be scared of that, because you just say Liz Truss.
I mean,
but isn't that the point?
If they just stuck to their guns from the beginning and didn't look like they were wavering around, is it going to be 28 billion? Is it going to be 26 billion? Is it going to be 18 billion? Then fine, fair enough. Make your point, make your argument, and say this is what we're doing because we believe in growth. But they are scared of what the Tories are saying. And what it looks like, at least from the right wing of politics, is that the attack lines that the Tories are using against them are working.
Rebecca?
Well, I don't think the polls bear that out, or the by-elections.
On this particular
but
policy,
I think to be fair, the polls and the by-elections do not bear that out.
So why are they wavering over it then?
Because they're trying to make sure that where Labour has had a historical weakness, time immemorial, is on the economy. Largely, because of, from the Jeremy Corbyn years, there was lots of attacks on Labour's handling of the economy. So you can see why Labour are being nervous. There's that great phrase, isn't there, which Roy Hattersley said, that Labour in opposition is like carrying a Ming vase over a highly polished floor. And I think that's the challenge they're doing. But I do have some sympathy with what you're saying. I think they should be stronger about this. It's a good policy. It's popular with business. It's popular on the doorstep.
But
it's popular
with the damage being done over confusion. What do you say to Aisha's point that it's post-Jeremy Corbyn years, the pledges to spend and borrow so much more, that the Ming vase strategy over this has come into play?
I take Aisha's comment about being nervous. I understand that the front bench are nervous about this, but this is a decision that is going to increase growth dramatically over the course of a parliament. We should be confident in our arguments. I think what's happened, unfortunately, over the last few months is that there's been a lot of dialogue in the media, and it's created an impression that there isn't confidence, when there actually is. When I speak to front bench colleagues about this, they've got very robust plans on the matter, and that's the message that we should be putting to our electorate. And even in the time when I was in the shadow cabinet, we had very robust plans, and we tried our best, and sometimes maybe failed on the messaging somewhat. I'll agree, and I'll take that on board. But we proved very clearly that the amount of money that we're investing was going to dramatically increase growth, was going to dramatically increase jobs and investment.
And you're convinced, but it's not even in the Let's Get Britain's Future Back, this Labour pamphlet, not the specific figure here. It's got Keir Starmer there on the front, but it's not in there. Why not?
There's a lot of detail that isn't in there, and the position in relation to each policy will be set out in far more detail prior to a general election. As we've seen with the dentist position, we outlined our policy on dentistry in quite a lot of detail, and the Tories stole it. So we have to be very careful in terms of what we set out in detail.
I mean, it's a good point. I'll come back.
OK, I don't think we're going to be borrowing this idea of borrowing 28 billion.
Why not?
Because we tried that under Liz Truss and it didn't work. OK, so this is the strategy and how you deal with our economy. I disagree, if I may. What's going to be important in the next election is who's going to manage this country through this continued difficult times with international headwinds affecting our economy.
Well,
what we're seeing here...
Are you saying that the Conservatives have?
Let me make my point, and then please come back. But to borrow 28 billion, which we have not got, which we have not. What are you going to do with it? Borrowing 28 billion that you have not got will see interest rates increase. If interest rates go up, so does inflation. We've just come through a period whereby we're seeing deficit come down, we're seeing debt come down as well, interest rates starting to settle as well. Why would you then want to jeopardise that by borrowing 28 billion?
And is this what's making
pounds?
These are the Tory attack lines that you call them,
Just to finish my point, because the other side are good. The reason why I compare it with
this is mainly about Labour, and I will come back to you. But Rebecca, you want to respond?
The reason why the comparison with Liz Truss is look how the market's punished, and look how fiscal responsibility is so important. Something the Conservatives pride ourselves on, which is why we moved on from that. And now Labour are very nervous about.
Tobias has made a really excellent point, and this is so important. I'm really glad you've raised this. Liz Truss totally spooked the markets because her unfunded tax cuts came out of nowhere, and we literally watched the pound crash as she. And then not only that, Kwasi Kwarteng went on Laura Kuenssberg and said there could be more cuts to come. The difference between that, and you're absolutely right to think about fiscal discipline, is that nobody could say that this policy is going to be sprung on anybody. This policy has been talked. Hang on, let me finish. Let me finish. This is something which has got huge buy-in from business, because they know that this is the kind of investment that we see happening in America, and the markets in America haven't been spooked by this. In fact, America's economy is growing really, really well. Jobs are growing well. Inflation is not as well as America.
Faster than Germany's right now.
That's because Germany. But your argument about spooking the markets doesn't bear witness on this, Tobias.
What about
because
to have tax cuts or not to have tax cuts? Isn't that the same row that is going on in the Conservative Party for the reasons you've just set out? Because you do not want to do anything that spooks the markets or looks unaffordable.
Absolutely.
Where are you on the tax cuts?
Absolutely right. Well, you heard Jeremy Hunt in the November statement. What did he do? He came out with £20 billion of tax incentives to get our industry and our business working, for them to invest in their capitalisation and move their countries.
And just recently he said there may not be as much scope for tax cuts.
There may not be, and that's again fiscal responsibility returning to the Conservative ranks.
Right, let's just have a look at this headline just before we move on. Cracks between Starmer and Reeves are starting to show over this particular issue, because Rachel Reeves says no policy is outside our fiscal rules, and no policy, including the Green Prosperity Plan, sits outside of those rules. That, in the end, is going to be more important than the investment in green policies.
Well, I think that's rubbish that there are cracks between Starmer and Reeves at the moment on this issue. And I think Rachel's right in terms of constantly outlining our fiscal rule that you only spend on your day-to-day spending what you receive in tax, and that you make sure that when you do invest and you borrow to invest, that you have your debt falling as a proportion of GDP over the course of a pilot. That is crucial.
Right.
It's important.
And it's more crucial.
That is achievable with the 28 billion. And Rachel's already done the calculations on that.
Anything different with public services funding than the Conservatives, if that is the line that you are taking? People have big expectations of what a Labour government might bring. They expect a lot more on public spending than what they're getting now. But you've basically just said you're not going to spend any more than the Tories on anything. So why are people voting for the Labour Party?
We're not saying we're not going to spend any more. That's our fiscal rule, but we will look at efficiencies in the system. I think Rachel has been very clear on that. And I think there's also, in my own personal view, I think there's a discussion to be had about the black hole that's in our public finances. Our local authorities and our public services are going to need an immediate injection of cash to deal with 15 years of chronic underfunding and austerity. And I hope that there are conversations that the party's having now. For example, looking at a wealth tax is one option that Rachel could consider.
Yeah, but she's not.
She's not at the moment, and hopefully...
Oh, you think she might?
Well, possibly. It's my hope, but she might not, but who knows? But there's certainly a growing consensus around this, and groups such as Patriotic Millionaires UK have been repeatedly campaigning on this issue.
Right, well, we'll leave it there, because we're going to talk about the Russia-Ukraine war, because tonight a US border and a Ukraine aid bill is being debated. It's a piece of legislation that pledges a further $60 billion in American military aid to Ukraine, amongst other things. Donald Trump has urged Republicans not to vote for it. Let's have a look at the reaction here in the Financial Times. Joe Biden, the US president, blames Donald Trump for sinking US deal to fund Ukraine war effort. Let's welcome Fred Fleitz from Washington, D.C. He served as Chief of Staff on Donald Trump's National Security Council. Hello to you. Why don't Trump supporters like this bill?
Pleasure to be here. Well, there is a growing concern in the United States that there has to be a plan to end this war, a route to a ceasefire, route to peace talks. There's a growing belief that this is a war of attrition Ukraine will lose. And there's no mention in this bill of peace talks or ceasefire. Instead, there's a call for a report on how we can provide weaponry to Ukraine so we can win the war. I would like Ukraine to win the war, but I think we're past that moment. And until there's a realistic approach to this conflict, I don't think it's going to get Republican support.
Right. I mean, Joe Biden, as you know, has had some pretty strong warnings and criticism for Republicans considering blocking the bill. He says Republicans owe it to the American people to show some spine and do what they know to be right. History is watching. A failure to support Ukraine at this critical moment will never be forgotten. Does that weigh heavily on your shoulders?
I think the argument that the appearance of Russia winning will be a threat to democracy, could embolden America's adversaries is a valid point. But frankly, we are past that moment. That's something Joe Biden should have thought of a long time ago when Ukraine needed the weapons which it could have used to win. We're now in a long-time ceasefire that is killing a generation of Ukrainian men. Trump says, let's end the fighting. And this isn't just the view of Republicans. Richard Haas, the President Council of Foreign Relations, no friend of Trump, he believes this. Henry Kissinger believes this. Let's stop the fighting. Let's freeze this conflict. Let's arm Ukraine to the teeth. Let's work on getting Ukraine its territory back through negotiations rather than destroying the country further.
All right, Fred, let's bring in our other guest, Tobias Elwood. How can you convince Fred Fleitz to have a different viewpoint to help this bill go through? He says the moment's passed.
I'm really concerned. I don't know if you speak for Donald Trump, but is that his position, that he would want a ceasefire, that he'd want to introduce talks, that he would allow Russia to redraw the map in Eastern Europe? Because if that happens, Russia will not stop there. You talk about giving Ukraine the weapon systems they need. Why isn't Donald Trump then pledging to say we will give Ukraine the ATACMS and the other missiles that they require? That's what we need to see. Otherwise, as I say, this is going to be one part of the world that changes in a very fragmented, contested world where we're seeing other problems around. The threshold for the West to handle all these plates spinning is really being tested now. We need to sort this out in Ukraine. And it really worries me that Donald Trump will come in here and want to close the issue off, even remove support, military funding and support for Europe as a whole.
Fred?
I think Trump will use his leadership to force Putin and Zelensky to come to the negotiating table. And this idea that Russia's going to invade other countries after Ukraine is frankly a myth. Russia has been the loser in this war.
You're willing
Ukraine's
to take that risk,
too. There's no doubt of that.
You're willing to take that risk.
Russia's military has been destroyed. Its reputation has been destroyed. And as I said, the moment when we could have given Ukraine the weapons to win, that moment has passed.
You still can give Ukraine the weapons to win.
Council of Foreign Relations disagrees with you. So did Henry Kissinger. So did a growing number of people on the left in the United States who don't see the point of an endless war of attrition. It's time to end this war. Let's start negotiations. The reality is we may have to wait Putin out until we can get this territory back to Ukraine.
All right.
But let's not
That's not a
advocate
strategy.
this nonsense that Russia's going to invade NATO after Ukraine. There's no evidence of that.
All right, Albie.
With respect to Fred, I don't think he is being entirely honest. This bill is also linked, of course, to the southern border crisis in the US, and there's been a bipartisan effort to try and get some more money to solve the problem at the southern border. Is this not really, Fred, about the fact that Donald Trump wants him to be elected later on this year with as much mess as possible coming from the Democrats so he can say, I'm the one that's going to clean it up? If this bill is seen as being successful at solving the issues on the southern border, if this bill is seen as being successful at solving the problems that we're seeing in Ukraine, there's less of a mess for Trump to clean up.
Fred?
I think it really was incumbent upon President Biden to have three separate votes on Israel, on Ukraine, and on the southern border. But instead, he held Ukraine hostage to the southern border and made a deal on the southern border that most Republicans oppose. And I know there's allegations right now that this bill's going down because Trump and his supporters don't want to give Biden win.
All right.
And look, maybe that's a valid argument, but I don't think that's the case.
And it is true that there were lots of things, and there are lots of things bound up in this bill, but I want to focus on what could happen as a result in terms of support for Ukraine. Last week, Tobias, the EU managed to get its Ukraine funding package approved, but it was a struggle. We're seeing Biden clearly facing those same struggles. Is there a trend here in terms of support in this financial way for Ukraine?
That is the worry that we're seeing, an accumulation of an absence of commitment that we're seeing. It's starting to wane as it drags on because we're not giving Ukraine the facilities and the military equipment that they need to conclude this. And it really worries me. It's really scary to hear somebody close to Donald Trump who possibly could get elected, saying, I'm happy to talk about a ceasefire, talks. That is appeasement. That's 1937 all over again.
All right, we'll come back to Fred in just a moment. Rebecca, your thoughts on this? Because we have heard in the last couple of years since this war started, it's fuelling inflation, making things like energy much more expensive here. Do you agree that Fred might have a point with some Republicans that it's not sustainable?
Well, the concerns I've got with the US vote is that it provides quite a lot of wider geopolitical instability. And the reason for this is that America, the US and the UK signed up in 1994 to a memorandum with Ukraine, and that was in return for Ukraine relinquishing its nuclear weapons arsenal on its exit from the Soviet Union. Now, interestingly, Russia was a party to that memorandum as well and haven't observed their obligations. But the question will be for the US to decide, are you a country that keeps your promises internationally or are you not a country that keeps your promises internationally? And that's where the instability lies.
Right. I mean, it is about reputation and standing in the world, Fred. The idea, as some of the guests have suggested, if there's less enthusiasm for America's commitment to NATO too and Article 5, that is going to lead to more instability.
Well, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so Article 5 doesn't apply here.
No,
and
but if it were to invade another country that is a member of NATO?
Putin is not going to risk a nuclear war by invading a NATO member, and I think people who assert that are making things up. But I think the points by your last guest are valid. We did make commitments to Ukraine. We didn't abide by them. As I said, that moment has passed. We can wish we hadn't done that, but we're in a situation now where Russia is deeply dug in. It is bringing up more reserves. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. And the responsible thing, the thing that I think is most responsible for the country is to end the war, get Ukrainian refugees to come back to the country, rebuild the country, arm the country to the teeth, and begin a long-term process to get Ukrainian territory back by peace. The fellow who spoke to you a moment ago, brilliant guy. If he believes that, why don't we send in British and American troops? That's how we could kick Russia out. No one wants to do that.
Ukraine is not asking for troops. They have plenty.
All right.
Ukraine has plenty of boots on the ground themselves, their own people. They've got the courage to step forward. What they're missing is the military equipment that we should be providing them.
Right. I mean, it is interesting, though, when you say, yes, they're not asking for troops on the ground, but the outgoing Chief of the General Staff, Aisha, General Sir Patrick Sanders, has warned that the UK needs to grow its military by around 45,000 in the next 3 years and equip a citizen army. I mean, is this the sort of thing that we need to be looking at?
Let's not kid ourselves. We are in no fit state right now. Even if we did want to put boots on the ground, that's not going to happen. But I think what's really interesting about your guest's argument, and I do agree with Tobias on this, it's just fascinating to hear somebody representing Donald Trump, who has had lots of criticism for having too close a relationship with President Putin, essentially saying, let's just appease Putin, let's just go slow, let's go on his timeline. I'm sure he will do the right thing and give Ukraine its land back. That is for the birds. Also, interestingly, if these guys are now putting forward an argument for an immediate ceasefire and getting around the table and talking, I presume they're going to say the same thing about the situation in Israel and Gaza right now.
I think it's interesting because we're getting this view from across the pond, which is saying, well, what's the end point of this conflict? Wow. And it doesn't really seem to be a discussion that we're having at all on this panel, or that we really have enough in Europe. It's just we must give Ukraine as much military aid as possible so they can beat Putin without actually thinking, well, what is the end game here? Which is why I think it's interesting to hear from Fred over in the US to actually talk about what an end game might look like. Yes, we might not like it, but shouldn't we be thinking about what the end game looks like and how we get there, rather than just condemning Ukraine and Russia to this endless war.
But I think the difficulty is to get any sort of talks, you're going to have to get Zelensky. In terms of all the people I speak to from Ukraine, I speak to Ukrainians regularly on my show. They have not done anything wrong. They have just gone about their lives, and Russia has invaded them to try and take their land and to take over their kind of society as well. So I think that would be fine if you could say, look, both sides had done some wrong. Come on, guys, let's meet in the middle. Let's hammer out a deal. For the Ukrainians, they understandably do not think they have done it, because they haven't. This is pure Russian aggression on Ukraine. That makes peace talks very, very, very difficult.
Exactly. We've entered a new era of insecurity. This
but what is the
one
end game?
Element of it. And that's why General Saunders spoke as he did. We need to brace ourselves and prepare ourselves for a new decade of instability. Our world is fragmented, becoming ever more contested. Indeed, it's splintering into two spheres of competing influence.
But Tobias,
you've got China, if I can finish, China, Russia, and indeed Iran, the global south sitting out, and then the West. And the West is too risk-averse to stand up to this latest round of aggression. This new period of instability is only going to grow. And if we allow Russia to move forward into Eastern Europe, it won't stop there. There's an awful lot of Europe that's not in NATO. That's where Russia will go to next.
But what does the West look like and European security with less US support? Because I guess this is the nub of the question, isn't it? If Donald Trump gets in, is he going to pull out of NATO? If Donald Trump gets in, is he going to put less military aid into Ukraine? What does that look like, European security, with less US support?
And that is
right, well, let me just
the FCO and indeed other parts.
All right, well, let's get a final thought. Is that what could happen, Fred, if, first of all, Donald Trump wins the Republican nomination, which looks highly likely, and were to win the presidential election? Pulling out of NATO, no longer Europe can rely on the US for support.
You know, I read The Economist, the London Guardian. I see all this extreme worry about Trump coming to office. I'll remind you that during 4 successive presidencies, Putin invaded neighboring states during 3 of them, but not the Trump administration, because Trump was a decisive leader who Putin thought was unpredictable. This isn't going to be appeasement. This is bringing back a credible and strong president to promote global security. That's what we need right now. That's why I think Trump has a chance of ending this war. It's going to be distasteful. I don't like seeing Russia holding on to any Ukrainian territory. But as I said, the moment has passed where we can roll this back by throwing more weapons in. We have to stop the killing.
But
we have
Trump
to rebuild
did threaten to pull out of NATO. That's not going to help European security.
We're going to finish it there.
No, that's not going to happen.
Oh, well, we heard it here first. Fred Fleitz, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to talk about something completely different, which is childcare and childcare policies. We've talked a lot about this already this week on the programme, and that's because you will remember that in the spring budget last year, parents of 2-year-olds were promised 15 hours free childcare a week from April, and then in September this year, eligible children from 9 months will get 15 hours of childcare per week during term time. But we now hear that this key policy pledge may not be met on time. Let's listen to the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan.
What you can't do, Trevor, which I think you probably know, is guaranteeing something in the future that you're not in control of all the bits.
Right. You're not in control of all the bits, as she put it so succinctly, and that sounds like she can't guarantee that the pledge will actually come into operation in April. Let's talk to Jerry Garvey, the owner of Muddy Boots Nursery in Penrith, Cumbria. Welcome to you. Can you deliver on the government's policy as it stands?
Firstly, good morning. No, in response to your question, the answer is no. I think the government are relying on, obviously, all the nursery providers to actually be on side and provide that service. Many of them, like myself at the moment, are not able to. One, because we're full already and there's no space. Secondly, those nurseries who may be able to provide have not got enough staff to reach their potential. And thirdly, the money they're offering does not meet the need of the nurseries.
Right. Well, Tobias, it sounds like there's a massive problem on the government's hand with this rather cornerstone key policy pledge.
And there's an awful lot of us, backbenchers, that are lobbying the Chancellor at this very moment to see whether we can actually fix this. And hopefully we will get an announcement in the March statement. it's so important that we honour this pledge, that we allow childcare to continue to grow and advance. So we're from 9 months to the age of school starting age, that parents are able to put their children in some form of a nursery.
Right.
That is our commitment. It was supposed to start in 2025. I think this full package of measures has been graduated. I will be lobbying very hard to make sure that we are still committed. What Gillian Keegan was talking about there was the numbers of stakeholders that are involved. And you just heard some comments there of some of the challenges that we face, the actual locations themselves, the number of nursing support and so forth. That all needs to be addressed. But ultimately, it comes down to money. And that's why the Chancellor, I hope, will make some positive announcements on this in March.
Right. I mean, Jerry, you're reassured by that. I mean, Tobias Ellwood seems to be crossing his fingers for a policy that he very much believes in, to hear what the Chancellor has to say next month.
Well, it sounds OK on paper, but firstly, what he's got to remember is, for the policy to work, you've got to have the staff. There's been a chronic underfunding in the childcare sector for many years now, and as a result, a lot of those who have worked in the sector have actually left and not gone on to other employment because it pays more. You know, unfortunately, the policies that are put in place, every year the funding's available, but what doesn't happen is it goes up the interest rates, meets the current interest rate when we have increases in national living wages, taxes and everything else. So there's a big divide between the two, and nursery just cannot afford to operate under that.
Right. I mean, Rebecca, you also, or the Labour Party, very much wants to have a transformative childcare policy. But again, I mean, look at what's happened here. Do you take notes that it's not that easy if you haven't got the staff and the places?
Well, you actually have to have a detailed plan, and I think this is where the government's problems lie, where they made a promise and broke that promise because they hadn't filled out the detail. There was a skills crisis when the Chancellor made that announcement. Childcare organisations warned him at the time that the promise was unsustainable without huge investment in the skills in that particular sector. Nurseries themselves, as Jerry has just said, can't afford to provide the extra childcare because their margins are so low. They're struggling as it is, and nurseries are closing up and down the country because they're not finding it financially sustainable.
So what could Labour do in the envelope that exists at the moment?
Well, what Bridget's agreed to do is to have a childcare review, to look at it with the sector comprehensively. And she's also been exploring plans to look at the role of primary schools and nurseries within primary schools to see if they can be used as a vehicle to roll out rapid childcare.
Right. I mean, there's obviously a gap here, Jerry, between ambition and desire on the politician side and what can practically be delivered. Are you turning parents away at the moment?
Yes, we are. I've actually got no places up until September 2025 in certain rooms. That's because the demand is so high and the availability of places is so low.
Albie?
Huge problem. I think it's absolutely right, and I'm so pleased Jerry brought up the fact that it's also a people problem, a workforce problem. I was having a conversation earlier on with someone from the Fawcett Society who said exactly the same thing. There just aren't enough people going into these childcare roles. So it's all well and good to say the government's going to spend £7 billion on nursery places by 2025. But if people aren't going into nursery teaching, no one is going to be able to send their children to nursery. And I think there's also something else that we can do. Not everything Liz Truss did was bad when she was in government. She did also start the conversation about childcare ratios in the United Kingdom compared to in European countries where childcare ratios are lower. So there is a regulatory reform aspect to this as well, which could deliver cheaper childcare.
I'll just get a note from... What did you make of the extending of ratios, Jerry, when Liz Truss suggested it? Would that be something you'd support?
Absolutely not. Right. For the reason, for those of us that work with children, especially this is inherent to the 2-year-olds. You know, the ratio originally was 1 to 4, and it's been increased to 1 to 5. You know, you've got 4 or 5 2-year-old children who need a lot of care and attention. Some are still not speaking yet, haven't got language. Some are still in nappies and that. For one practitioner, that's a lot to take on. If you have a busy nursery class, it can be quite stressful some days. The end result is, if we do 1 to 5 over long term, we burn our staff out and we have more emotional wellbeing problems, and that adds to our recruiting woes.
Well, I'm actually on the board of the Fawcett Society, so this is something that we have been looking into a great deal. It's really important for children's development to have good, high-quality childcare. It's also so important for not just mums but dads, families as well, in terms of trying to get people back to work. And I think If you care about families and if you care about trying to support people back into work, you have got to properly support this service. It's sort of, again, there's a theme through this programme, whether it's dentistry, whether it's NHS waiting lists, whether it's mental health services, whether it's our care sector. You've got a crisis in all these services.
And does it all need money? Is it money that will
I'm afraid it does need money. It needs a number of things. Money is very, very important. You cannot do childcare on the cheap. It is not fair to expect nursery providers and nursery staff in the same way it's not fair to expect carers who are paid barely minimum wage to pick up the slack for the fact that this stuff is not properly invested. What you also need, to Albie's point, and this applies to carers and other things as well, if you are making, and it is often women working in these low-paid sectors where they are paid peanuts, they are expected to pick up the emotional slack of families where it's caring for older people, caring for our babies and our toddlers. If we care about this connective tissue of society, we as a society and as a state, and come together, wherever your politics are, and say, we've got to fund this properly.
No disagreement here from the politicians. It sounds like you're committed to that. Jerry, if there was one thing that the politicians could do to help you deliver the policy as it stands, what would it be?
I think more engagement with the actual sector itself. I've heard a couple of times in here, let's engage with this and that. I go to lots of meetings and speak to lots of nursery providers, be up in Cumbria. I go nationally with the likes of National Day Nurseries Association. And the sense of the matter I get sometimes is there's just not enough engagement or lip service is paid to what they're saying. These people are the professionals. They need to be listened to. You know, they're not there to con anybody out of their money. They want it to work. At the end of the day, it's people's children, and we should remember that.
Thank you very much, Jerry. You wanted to say something.
Just reflecting on that, one of the things that the late, great Dame Tessa Giles did was when she was in opposition with a lot of other really good Labour women MPs, including Harriet Harman and others, they knew childcare was a huge issue, and they really, and that was a big thing of more women coming into Parliament as well in 1997. And the Sure Start centres, which was very much a project pioneered by the brilliant Tessa Giles, had a really big impact. And I think it would be really good for political parties not to use things like this as a political football, because that was actually quite a good structure. Children's care is too important for it just to be weaponised and politicised.
Well, it may be discussed at Prime Minister's questions. Let's go into the chamber because MPs are filing in for questions beforehand. We've got a few minutes to go. And, of course, Rishi Sunak may be mulling over the launch of another group or family within the Conservative fraternity and sorority. It was called Popular Conservatism, led by his predecessor, Liz Truss. What do you make of the group?
Populism is dangerous. It builds on fears, it uses sound bites to try and win across support, and it's very short-termism. We've just spoken about the rise of authoritarianism across the world. We're seeing an erosion in democracies as well. And I don't want to see it in Britain, and I certainly don't want to see it in the Conservative Party. We're months away from a general election. So to learn that yet another group is being formed that's not rallying and supporting the Prime Minister, frankly, I really don't understand it. It stems, I'm afraid, from our system, the fact that we choose a leader and it's our membership that makes that decisions. And all this, the noise that's being made, whether it be whatever group it is all about appeasing our base, not looking beyond our base. Our successful prime ministers are the ones that take our base forward, but appeal to the country as a whole. Right. That's what we should be doing, and that's what Rishi Sunak is doing.
Right. I mean, I would be careful by insulting the Tory base. It's the Tory base that goes out every weekend campaigning out of the goodness of their hearts
they are
for free for MPs like you to stay in Parliament. So just be careful about what you say about the base. The base, actually, at the last leadership election, wanted Kemi Badenoch and Penny Mordaunt in the final two. The MPs gave us Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. So you'll have a part in what's happened with the Conservative Party since 2022. What I would say about populism, though, is that I totally agree with you. I think Liz Truss's popcorn is a complete farce. But we've got to think about why populism happens. It's because ruling parties don't do what they say on the tin. The Conservatives haven't cut migration, we haven't cut taxes, we haven't been good enough on defence, and that is when populism thrives.
Right. I mean, expectation management is very important, isn't it, for political parties? Is that why Keir Starmer is as careful and as cautious in so many of the areas in politics as he is at the moment, according to some on your wing of the party?
I think so, but then the real test will come when we're in government, when those expectations from our constituents will be rightly high, because they will expect a Labour government to make their lives better. And that's what we need to do in the first 100 days of government, in outlining bold, radical policies. We've already got some. The New Deal for working people's fantastic. Some of the green policies that we've outlined, fantastic. But we're going to have to go a lot further to win and retain that trust of our voter base, to show that the Labour Party really does change lives.
Aisha?
Well, I think what the Conservative Party is about to go through is what happened in the Labour Party, where a populist base sort of dominates the party. And I think you are about to enter your sort of blue momentum phase, and that will mean a lot of infighting. I mean, there's already been a lot of
Not if some of us can help it.
And it will be a gift to the Labour
But why
Party.
has Rishi Sunak not been able to convince Jacob Rees-Mogg, Liz Truss and all those other people that were at that popcorn, as they call it?
If I'm honest,
yesterday?
I think they've potentially written off our prospects at the next election, and that makes it harder.
Have
but
you?
I stress, and I just underline, the importance of our base. But our membership also recognise that MPs, the parliamentarians, need to make that final decision.
All
So
right.
include the membership, but allow the MPs the final
Let's listen
choice.
to Rishi Sunak.
Speaker, I know the thoughts of the House and the country are with the King and his family. We wish His Majesty a speedy recovery and look forward to him resuming his public-facing duties in due course. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Claire Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also send my best wishes to the King. Last week, the Foreign Secretary said that we, with allies, will look at the issue of recognising a Palestinian state so that the Palestinian people can see irreversible progress towards a two-state solution. But afterwards, it was briefed that these words had not been signed off by number 10. Does the Prime Minister agree with his Foreign Secretary?
Mr. Speaker, our long-standing position has been that we will recognise a Palestinian state at a time that is most conducive to the peace process. But the most important thing is we are committed to that two-state solution and working with our allies to bring it about.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People in Northampton South are desperately short of NHS dental provision. Indeed, in Duston, there is now none at all. So today's dentistry recovery plan announcements are hugely welcome. But can the Prime Minister guarantee my residents improvements within months and not years?
Mr. Speaker, we are publishing the dentistry recovery plan today, and my honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will be making a statement shortly. Over 1 million more people saw an NHS dentist last year than the year before, but we know that there is more to do, and that's why the recovery plan will make sure that NHS dental care is faster, simpler and fairer for patients and staff.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join with the Prime Minister in sending His Majesty the King our very best wishes for his treatment. Across this House, we all look forward to seeing him back to full health as quickly as possible. Mr. Speaker, this week the unwavering bravery of Brianna Jay's mother, Esther, has touched us all. As a father, I can't even imagine the pain that she's going through, and I'm glad that she's with us in the gallery here today. Mr. Speaker, a year ago, the Prime Minister promised to bring NHS waiting lists down. Isn't he glad he didn't bet $1,000 on it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at least I stand by my commitments. He's so indecisive, the only bet he'd make is an each-way bet.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he says he stands by his commitments. He once insisted that if he missed his promises, these are the words he used, I'm the Prime Minister, and then he said, it's on me personally. Today we learned from his own officials that he's the blocker to any deal to end the doctor strikes. Yep. And he's always, every time he's asked, he blames everyone else. So what exactly did he mean when he said it's on him personally if he doesn't meet his promise?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are bringing the waiting list down for the longest waiters. We're making progress. But it's a bit rich, Mr. Speaker, to hear about promises from someone who's broken every single promise he was elected on. I I think I counted almost 30 in the last year. Pensions, planning, peerages, public sector pay, tuition fees, childcare, second referendums, defining a woman. Although in fairness, that was only 99% of a U-turn. The list goes on, but the theme is the same, Mr. Speaker. It's empty words, broken promises, and absolutely no plan.
Keir Starmer.
Of all the weeks to say that, when Brianna's mother is in this chamber, shame, parading as a man of integrity when he's got absolutely no responsibility. Absolute. Of all.
Either side. I think the member's getting carried away. Can I just say that our constituents want to hear the questions and they certainly want to hear the answers. They don't want to hear organised barracking. So please, I want no more. Keir Starmer.
I think the role of the Prime Minister is to ensure that every single citizen in this country feels safe and respected. It's a shame the Prime Minister doesn't share that. I welcome the fact that he's finally admitted that he's failed on waiting lists in the NHS. I also welcome that he's finally acknowledged the crisis in NHS dentistry. He's calling it a recovery plan after 14 years of Tory government. What exactly does he think the NHS dentistry is recovering from?
Prime Minister. As ever, Mr. Speaker, he seems to convene.
Certainly not having enough of the front bench either. Please, I want to hear it. The election fever, I'm hoping, is not coming tomorrow, so let's not behave as though it is. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as ever, he conveniently forgets the impact of a pandemic on NHS dentistry, and it was specifically because of the close proximity nature of dental provision that it was unable to operate as normal throughout the pandemic. That was the recommendation of the medical and clinical experts, Mr. Speaker, which is why inevitably there is a backlog in dental care and the impact that has. But that's why, as my honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will outline later today for the House, we're putting more funding in to provide more NHS provision across the country, on top of plans that will see the number of dental training places increased by 40%, Mr. Speaker. But I would actually just point out, our plans mean that there will be 2.5 million more NHS appointments, which is in fact 3 times more than the Labour Party are proposing.
Mr. Speaker, there are some areas in the country where you literally can't have an NHS dentist, and he says that's down to COVID. People are literally pulling out their own teeth.
Sorry. Can I just say, I don't need any more off this front bench either. Do we understand each other? Carry on, please,
Speaker, people are literally pulling their teeth out using pliers. It's an experience that can be compared with extracting an answer from the Prime Minister at this dispatch box. The truth is, after 14 years of neglect, this recovery plan is just a desperate attempt to try to recover back to square one. If he wanted to move forward, he should follow Labour, scrap the non-dom tax status, use the money to fund 2 million more hospital appointments every year. But, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is oddly reluctant to follow us on this. What exactly is so special about this tax avoidance scheme that the Prime Minister prioritises it above the NHS?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let's look at that record. We've, in the NHS, record funding, record doctors and nurses, record number of appointments, higher cancer survival rates. But what's happening under Labour's watch in Wales, Mr. Speaker? Let's have a look. A fifth of people in Wales are currently on a waiting list. Waits of 18 months or more are 10 times higher than that in England, and people are waiting twice as long for an operation. Their failure has sent the Welsh NHS back to square one, and will never let them do that here.
Mr. Speaker, when he admitted that he'd failed on waiting lists, I actually thought that we might be entering a new era of integrity, professionalism and accountability. Remember that one? But just like all the other relaunches, it's proved to be a false dawn, still blaming everyone else, still removed from reality. It's very simple. You can either back more NHS appointments or more tax avoidance? We know what side we're on. Why doesn't he?
Mr. Speaker, the best way to ensure that we continue to fund the NHS, as we have, is not to make £28 billion of unfunded spending commitments. And just this morning, independent Treasury officials have published a formal costing of just one part of their eco-promise, their insulation scheme, and it turns out that it will cost double what they had previously claimed. Not the £6 billion that Labour accounted for, but £13 billion every single year. It's now crystal clear they have absolutely no plan, but we all know how they're going to fund that gap. More taxes on hard-working people.
Yes, Starmer. Mr. Speaker, this is Mr. 25 tax rises. He's literally the country's expert on putting taxes up, and he thinks he can lecture everyone else on the economy. Last week, he and his MPs were laughing at someone whose mortgage had gone up £1,000 a month. This week, he's casually made a £1,000 bet in the middle of an interview. Last week, he thought even raising questions about the cost of living was, and I quote, resorting to the politics of envy. And this week, he's finally found the cause that he wants to rally around, the non-dom status. When he finds himself backing tax avoidance over NHS appointments, does he start to understand why his own MPs are saying he simply does not get what Britain needs?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to take any lectures about getting Britain from a man who thought it was right to defend terrorists, Mr. Speaker. But what we're doing is building a brighter future for our country. And just the last week, expanding healthcare in pharmacies. Today, expanding dental care. This week, helping millions with the cost of living. And most importantly, cutting national insurance. All while the Labour Party argue over 28 billion different ways to raise people's taxes. That's the difference between us. We're delivering a plan. They can't even agree on one.
My constituents and I send our best wishes to the King and royal family. Mr. Speaker, despite the popular narrative, our economy is doing well, with an unemployment rate well below the EU average, strong inward investment and record employment. Taxes are higher than Conservatives would like, but does my right honourable friend agree that a key reason for this is that we rightly spent £400 billion on COVID support, including one of the most generous furlough schemes, in order to ensure that no one got left behind, and that it is our intention and instinct to lower taxes, unlike the parties opposite.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to highlight our record of providing support to the country when it needed it, whether it's the NHS, vaccines or furlough during COVID, or most recently help with people's energy bills. We're only able to afford that because of the strong management of our economy, which is why we must stick with the plan, not risk going back to square one with the Labour Party, who, as we know, have absolutely no plan and will cost everyone in this country with their £28 billion worth of tax rises.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I begin by expressing my heartfelt sympathies to Brianna's mother, who is in the public gallery as we speak, and also to send my best wishes to King Charles in what will hopefully be a quick and full recovery. Mr. Speaker, the public are used to the Tories gambling on the lives of others. Boris Johnson, he did it with public health during the pandemic. His immediate successor, she did it with household finances. So, not to be outdone, the Prime Minister on Monday this week accepted a crude bet regarding the lives of asylum seekers. In doing so, he demeaned them as individuals and he degraded the office that he currently holds. So can I ask him, will he apologise?
Mr. Speaker, we may have a principal disagreement on this. I believe, and we believe, that if someone comes to this country illegally, they shouldn't be able to stay, they should be removed, and that's why we're committed to our Rwanda scheme.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, as ever, the Prime Minister does himself no favours, because, of course, the bet to which we are referring was worth £1,000, and it came just hours before the Prime Minister ended cost of living support worth just £900. And his justification for doing so was that the cost of living crisis is easing. So can I ask him, what does he believe leaves him looking most out of touch with the public? Gambling £1,000 or believing that the cost of living crisis is getting better?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he talks about the cost of living. Perhaps he can explain to the Scottish people why it is that whilst the UK Conservative government is cutting their taxes, the Scottish government is raising them.
Mr. Speaker, the thoughts of the people of East Worthing and Shoreham are with His Majesty as well. The Archbishop of Canterbury has admitted that since taking office, the attendance at the Church of England has dropped by 15%. And in the 10 years to COVID, the number of baptisms in the Church of England has fallen from 140,000 a year to 87,000. So Christianity in the UK seems to be on the wane, unless apparently you are from a Muslim country in the middle of an asylum claim, and we are now told that 1 in 7 occupants of the BB Stockholm have suddenly become practising Christians. Can I ask the Prime Minister, given that the Church of England has now issued secret guidance for clergy supporting asylum applications for these Damascene conversions, who is the Church accountable to, and are taxpayers being scammed by the Archbishop?
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to illegal migrants, we need to have a system whereby if someone comes here illegally, they shouldn't be able to stay. I can tell him that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has asked for more information about the extent to which migrants converting to Christianity is playing a role in our asylum system, and more generally, under our Illegal Migration Act, anyone entering the UK illegally will not be granted asylum here. That's why we need to have somewhere to send them and why our Rwanda scheme is so important. The Labour Party have blocked these measures every single step of the way because they don't have a plan and they won't keep Britain safe.
Sir Geoffrey Donnells.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I, on behalf of my party, extend our best wishes to His Majesty the King for a full recovery. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Prime Minister for his dedication and leadership in helping us to restore our place in the United Kingdom and its internal market, and to revive our political institutions at Stormont. The Union is more secure as a result of our combined endeavours, and together we have greatly enhanced the potential to build a strong and prosperous economy that will help to cement our peace in Northern Ireland. Mr. Speaker, securing peace in an unstable world is vital for all of us. And therefore, will the Prime Minister examine the findings of a recent report by Policy Exchange that calls for Northern Ireland to play an even greater role in the defence of our nation?
Prime Minister.
Can I start by thanking and paying tribute to my honourable friend for his own leadership over the past few months. He and I agree that the Union is stronger for the return of devolution and the work that we've done. I'd be delighted to examine the findings of the report, and I've seen with my own visits the vital role that Northern Ireland is playing through the location of firms like Tallers and Harland and Wolff. But as he will know, I'm delighted in last week's command paper we specifically committed to examining how we can further bolster Northern Ireland's share of the UK defence sector, because it's another essential pillar of our precious economic union.
Virginia Crosby.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister know where the best site for large-scale new nuclear in the UK is? And will he commit to buying the Wilver site, now the only gigawatt site in Wales this year, and make sure it's progressed as soon as possible to meet our net zero and energy security needs and give the enormous boost to the Ynys Môn and North Wales economy?
Prime Minister. As ever, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion for Wilfer and the nuclear industry. I can confirm to her that Wilfer is a candidate for the new nuclear site and one of a number of potential sites that could host civil nuclear projects. No decisions have been taken at present, but Great British Nuclear is working with the government to support access, and we're also developing a new national policy statement providing the planning framework for new nuclear power, and would very much welcome her and other contributions to that consultation.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, last year the Prime Minister and other senior ministers were given the conclusions of a government audit of research programmes at UK universities with links to the Chinese state. The audit flagged up hundreds of programmes of being at high risk of being used potentially by the CCP for military use and other applications in strategic and sensitive areas that are of high interest to an authoritarian regime such as China. A smaller proportion were judged to be extremely high risk. Despite that, the government has elected to do nothing about it. So will the Prime Minister confirm his personal knowledge of that report and explain to the House why no action is to be taken? These programmes have to be continued unimpeded.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to take a robust and proactive approach towards our relationship with China, rooted in the UK's national interest and values. And in fact, our National Security Act, which we passed last year, brings together vital new measures to protect our national security, and that includes creating a foreign influence registration scheme through the Act, which has been created to tackle specifically covert influence in the UK, and will continue to take all possible powers to keep the country safe.
Two remarkably talented and enthusiastic individuals from Kettering, Becky Horrell and Lindsay Atkins, have put together a really ambitious £2 million bid to repurpose the redundant Gala Bingo Hall site in Kettering High Street into a community arts, music, business and family hub, which would be simply transformative for Kettering Town Centre. Would my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, please be kind enough to facilitate a meeting for us with the relevant culture and levelling up ministers so we can explore how a combined community ownership fund and cultural development fund bid might get us across the line?
Prime Minister. Well, can I thank my honourable friend for highlighting this exciting initiative and also commend Becky and Lindsay for their campaigning. He'll know that our £150 million community ownership fund is there specifically to help safeguard small but much loved local assets, and indeed our cultural development fund, like the one he mentions, is there to support further cultural projects as well. I will ensure that he gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss these plans further and wish him and his constituents all the best with this redevelopment project.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Data revealed by the Centre for Cities showed that after 14 years of Tory rule, towns and cities in every corner of our country have been levelled down, left behind and left out of pocket. On average, people are over £10,000 a year worse off because his party has failed on growth. When will the Prime Minister take responsibility for breaking Britain?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, in fact, what we're seeing is record investment in our towns across the UK, many of which were neglected by the Labour Party for decades, Mr. Speaker. But if we really care about levelling up, what we need to do is avoid saddling hard-working Britons with higher taxes, which is exactly what Labour's £28 billion green spending spree would do.
Speaker, for 27 years, constituents across the Vale of Glamorgan and across the whole of Wales sadly have to wait longer to see a doctor, longer for an ambulance, longer at A&E and longer for an operation than patients in England. There are 24,785 patients in Wales waiting longer than 2 years for an operation. That number in England is 227. Does my right honourable friend agree that Aneurin Bevan will be turning in his grave on the fact that you can't trust Labour with the NHS?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. Whereas here in England we have a plan when it comes to education, where we're marching up the league tables and we have virtually eliminated those waiting the longest amount of time. But in Labour-run Wales, as he said, education rates are falling and waiting lists over 18 months are more than 10 times higher than here in England. It's crystal clear we should stick to our plan for a brighter future and not go back to square one with Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to Open Democracy this week, since 1999, at least 391 people have died at our borders. That is a rate, Prime Minister, of more than one man, one woman per month for 25 years. And on top of this, the financial cost of this deadly and failed border regime, as well as the Prime Minister's plan for Rwanda, is estimated to cost at least £800 million since 2014. So will the Prime Minister now show that he understands that the people whose lives he's making sick bets on are human beings and provide them with safe routes to the UK in order to seek asylum, instead of more failed and extreme forms of deterrence?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's in fact criminal gangs that are exploiting vulnerable people and leading many of them to lose their lives as they make these dangerous crossings. Now, on this side of the House, we think that's wrong and we want to do something about it, which is why we need to get a deterrent up and running and be able to send people to Rwanda. It's his party that opposes that, so the question for them is why do they remain on the side of the criminal people smugglers?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. February marks Emotional Health, Boost Your Self-Esteem and Children's Mental Health Month. In recent years, something like 6,500 people die in the UK each year due to suicide. And in 2021, I was nearly one of them. Luckily, my attempt failed. I was found by family members quickly. I received amazing care at St Helier and Springfield hospitals, didn't do any permanent damage, and was well looked after by the NHS in the months that followed. And I want to take this chance to say thank you to everyone who saved me, and sorry to my family and loved ones who I put through such an awful ordeal. In that moment, I felt alone and scared and like there was no way out, and that the world would be better off without me in it. But I don't recognise that man anymore. I know that nothing is ever really worth that. Help really is out there, and I'm pretty awesome. Does the Prime Minister agree that one death by suicide is one too many? And will he send a message from the dispatch box today that whatever you're going through, you are not alone, that help is out there, and better days lie ahead?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House will join me in commending my honourable friend for his bravery in sharing his story. And I can absolutely assure him that we take this issue incredibly seriously. The new suicide prevention strategy ensures that we will have the actions in place to reduce suicide over the next years, because we absolutely recognise the impact that it has on people, their families, and we should do everything we can to prevent that from happening.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I take the opportunity to ask the Prime Minister if he will consider apologising to Brianna Gray's mother for his insensitive comment. But turning to my question, the independent report into Teesworks, released last Monday, throws up more questions than it answers. And it's vital that we now have a National Audit Office investigation. The report was scathing and said there is insufficient transparency to offer evidence of value for money. Shouldn't the government lead by example, and will the Prime Minister finally release details of his conversations surrounding Teesworks, as he was asked to do twice last year?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Honourable Lady was talking about the report in Teesworks, as far as I could see, and what that report noted was that the pace and scope of the regeneration had a wide-reaching positive impact on the local economy, and of course it was an independent external report. It makes it clear that there's no evidence of corruption or illegality, and the government will of course respond to the recommendations in the report as soon as possible.
Alicia Cairns.
Speaker, can I give my heartfelt thanks to the Prime Minister for his support for our Melton, Harborough and Stamford villages following the recent devastating flooding. But tens of homes, farms and businesses in Rutland were also devastated. But our county is in effect excluded from ever receiving support in the future due to the arbitrary flaw that is currently put in place. Flood support should be based on the most affected or a percentage of population, but Rutland has to have 1,000th more flooding than next door Lincolnshire for us ever access support. So will my right honourable friend please give a meeting to me and the member for Swindon South to discuss this important issue?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, I extend my sympathies to all those impacted by the recent storms and flooding. We are investing record sums in flood defence across England, and the recovery support framework is in place for families and businesses in every area that have experienced exceptional flooding. I know that my honourable friend is in touch with DLUC ministers about how those schemes affect her constituency, but I'll ensure that she gets the correspondence and meetings that she needs to deliver for her local communities.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, I challenged the Prime Minister on his government's broken promise on building new hospitals by 2030, including in my own area. But now it seems that the government are downgrading existing hospitals too. Children and parents in Eastbourne will be forced to travel for miles if the proposed downgrade of the hospital's paediatric services goes ahead. Campaigners have asked the government to call in this disastrous plan. Will the Prime Minister agree?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually, we're investing record sums in improving hospital infrastructure across the country. In Eastbourne, in particular, spades are already in the ground to deliver an elective surgical hub, Mr. Speaker. And I know that there is local Liberal Democrats scaremongering about the future of services. But the local Conservative MP is doing a fantastic job engaging with her community and working with local health officials.
Jane Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday it was my huge pleasure to host the Aerospace Defence and Security Industry Apprenticeships event in Parliament, welcoming 2 apprentices from Collins Aerospace in Wolverhampton. Would he join me in National Apprenticeships Week for celebrating the opportunities apprenticeships can provide in the defence industry and also in our armed forces, who are all in our top 10 apprenticeship providers?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight the importance of our apprenticeship provision, which is providing young people with opportunities across the country, but particularly, as she says, in the defence and aerospace sector. And those plans are in stark contrast to those of the party opposite, who have caved into big business and are now proposing to halve the amount of apprenticeship funding and halve the number of apprenticeships.
Kenny McCaskill.
If Grangemouth refinery closes, Scotland will be the only major oil-producing nation without a refinery capacity. At a time of energy insecurity, is it not economic madness to allow a profitable plant to close? And is it not environmental madness to transship oil for refining and distribution across the growingly dangerous high seas? Given the billions that he has received from North Sea oil and the billions that he will continue to receive from North Sea oil, will he ensure that Scotland retains a refinery capacity for Scotland's oil?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the future of Grangemouth refinery is obviously a commercial decision for their owners, but I'm told that the site will remain operating as a refinery until at least May of 2025. And in the meantime, the UK and Scottish governments are working together to seek assurances from Grangemouth about how they are supporting employees. But we remain confident in our fuel supply. And in terms of energy security, which you mentioned, that's why this government is unambiguously backing the North Sea oil and gas sector, because that's how you support energy security in this country, attract investment and create jobs, particularly in Scotland.
Dame Caroline Downs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was very proud that it was a Conservative government that appointed the Patient Safety Commissioner, and proud that we commissioned the Hughes report into medical devices and medicines, which was published this morning. Will my right honourable friend also make me proud that we can address the points she has raised and bring forward a redress scheme in a timely manner?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to the Patient Safety Commissioner and her team for their work on this important issue, one which I know my honourable friend has spoken about in the past. Of course, our sympathies, first and foremost, remain with those affected by sodium valproate. We're focused on improving the system and how the system listens to patients, and it's right that the government carefully considers the report's recommendations. The Department for Health will be responding to the report in due course, and the Health Secretary will keep the House updated on a regular basis.
Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my Tamworth constituents, like local mom Jessica, have contacted me about special educational needs and disability support. Jessica's son has waited years for an autism diagnosis and doesn't expect to have an education, health and care plan in place by the time that he goes to secondary school. Will the Prime Minister confirm that students that need an EHCP will get them so that they can thrive in school?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course we want to see every child thrive at school, which is why we've tripled the amount going into special educational needs for capital places and put more money in to support EHCP plans. I'm sorry to hear about the case you mentioned. I'll make sure that we continue to look at that in particular, because, as she said, we want every child to thrive at school.
Charlotte Shelbrooke.
Wishes to His Majesty the King and Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales.
I know my right honourable friend, and building on the answer to my right honourable friend, is exceptionally pleased with the huge report that's come out today. And there's been a huge amount of work that's taken across this chamber from the Honourable Lady for Livingston, the Honourable Lady for Washington, and my right honourable friend for Southampton and Romsey. May I push the point, though, to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, that tens of thousands of women and children have suffered immensely since the 1970s, and government after government has not done anything about this. I'm proud that this government has done something about it. So can I urge my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, in the strongest possible terms, to talk to our right honourable friend, the Chancellors, to make sure that at the budget we can really address the issues raised in the huge report.
Minister.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend and colleagues on all sides of the House for their campaigning over many years on this issue. As I said, it's right that we not only do we extend our sympathies to those affected, that we carefully consider the recommendations from the Commissioner's report, and I can assure him we will do that with all due haste, and I know that the Health Secretary will keep the House updated.
Final question, Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why did the Prime Minister downgrade the role of Minister for Disabled People? What message does he think this sends to them? And will he commit to reconsider this move, ensure the role is a Minister of State? And if not, will he agree to meet with me and disabled people's organisations and explain his reasoning?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually, the Minister for Disabled People is going to do a fantastic job because she passionately cares about this issue, and this government has a record to be proud of, whether it's supporting many more of those with disabilities into work, ensuring they can live independently, or making sure that children with complex disabilities have access to more changing places across the country, because those, Mr. Speaker, are the values of this Conservative government. And Mr. Speaker, I could just say also to Brianna Gray's mum, who is here, as I've said earlier this week, what happened was an unspeakable and shocking tragedy, Mr. Speaker. And as I said earlier this week, in the face of that, for her mother to demonstrate the compassion and empathy that she did last weekend, I thought demonstrated the very best of humanity in the face of seeing the very worst of humanity, and she deserves all our admiration and praise for that.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
Well, that brings us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's questions. Let me introduce our guests for this part of Politics Live. First of all, for the government, Laura Trott, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Bridget Phillipson for Labour, the Shadow Education Secretary, and Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Let's pick up on that. Was quite striking at the end of Prime Minister's questions. Clearly, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, feeling that he had to say something in response to a question being raised by a Labour MP of his insensitive, as she put it, his insensitive comments on trans rights, which was in between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, obviously trading barbs, if you like, when the mother of the murdered trans teenager, Brianna Jai, was watching in the gallery at PMQs. Just shows how sensitive these issues are.
Yeah, and there will be some saying that Rishi Sunak should, never make references like that. It doesn't matter whether someone's sitting there or not. But on the other hand, the idea, of course, that the grieving mother was sitting in the press gallery, Esther Jai. She is here, incidentally, because she is attending a Westminster Hall debate about mindfulness in schools, organised by her local MP. As you say, that was picked up on because previously Rishi Sunak has mocked Sir Keir Starmer about self-declaration for trans people, for example, for, as he would put it, not knowing what a woman is. It's something he said many times before, but of course on today of all days, incredibly unfortunate. He obviously, as you say at the end there, didn't quite apologise, but did make a reference back to it. And I think it just shows when political knockabout meets the real world, actually, is what that shows, I think.
Laura Trott, should he apologise?
Look, I saw the brilliant interview that Laura Kuenssberg did this weekend with Brianne's mother, and what happened was obviously completely horrific. What Brianne's mum was talking about there was specifically around social media and around mindfulness, both of which I think we need to look at in light of this. I don't think we should make this a huge issue about trans. That's not what she said this weekend, that was what it was mainly about, and I think we need to be very sensitive and listen to what Brianne's mum had to say.
No, absolutely. But the fact that she was there and in the knockabout, as Vicky said, things can be said that feel and seem very inappropriate at the time. So much so that the Prime Minister felt he did have to reference it at the end of PMQs. But he's been asked to apologise for those comments in the light of today. Should he?
I think he was clear about what Keir's comments were about this in the past. You know, they're public comments. I think, as I said, I don't want to make this all about trans because that's not what Brianne's mum wants to talk about with this, right? She wants to talk about social media and whether we should be looking at more of a ban on social media. That's a very, important issue that we should be talking about. Mindfulness in schools. She's got this Westminster. I think that's what we should be focusing on.
Right, you're not going to say that Rishi Sunak should apologise. Are you going to continue to demand that he apologises for those comments today?
Well, I think what we saw demonstrates what happens when discussion around certain issues becomes divorced from people's lives and experiences. And what has frustrated me with so much of this wider discussion, whether it's about the role for schools or what we see around trans people, is that we do need to treat one another with some basic respect, basic decency and compassion. And especially where it comes to children and young people, it should be about their well-being, what they need in terms of support. And sadly, I have to say, far too often in recent months with the Conservative Party, it's become a means of getting a cheap headline, pitching for the leadership.
No, that's not right.
It has.
That's not right.
It really
we've been
has.
pointing out
And these are people's lives. This is children's well-being. That should be our focus.
It is right that, yes, it is children's well-being, and it's right that we talk about the impact that some of the practices we've had has had on children's well-being. And I think Kemi has done that incredibly effectively. We have to be able to talk about these things. We must do it in a sensible way, but we must be able to talk about these things.
It's all about her and all about the leadership contest to come in the Conservative Party.
You're just trying to belittle.
It's because I believe it's important. I believe passionately in children's well-being. Yes, she hasn't. She's made it about headline grabbing in the Daily Telegraph, not about children.
What would you be advising as Education Secretary if you win the next election? What sort of guidance would you be issuing?
I agree that schools need guidance. That's what I've heard across the country from school leaders.
Do they, or do they need to be mandated on issues around things like trans rights in schools and how it should be sorted?
They want clear guidance because they want to avoid there being variation or dispute arising because of that lack of clarity. So I agree with the government that we do need to see guidance.
Do you agree with Kemi?
No, I don't.
What do you disagree policy-wise?
What do you disagree with? No, I don't. Well, the fundamental disagreement that I have is that this is too important to make it about... If I could please finish, Laura. I believe it is too important to make it about personal ambition. I agree. If I could just finish. We do need guidance on this, but we need to do it in a way that is respectful and takes account of what is a very complex and sensitive issue. It is right, therefore, that what the government have published is a consultation document that many organisations in school, including school leaders and children's charities, will be responding to. It is important
making it about the person. Exactly what you're saying. You're not talking about the issues.
You're talking about
remember,
Kemi
Badenoch
issue
is
right.
the Equalities
She is, and it is a joint document between Kemi Badenoch and the Education Department, which has been the subject of extensive dispute between those two departments precisely because of her personal ambition.
That is outrageous. She's dealing with the issues that are facing the government. And if you can't say that you disagree with any of the policies that she's putting forward, then you're just making ad hominem
personal
attack.
I disagree with the inflammatory language that is used on an area of children's well-being.
But you don't disagree with the policy?
I agree with the need for guidance. We are looking carefully at the exact measures. Many organisations are looking in detail at its practical application.
And it's a very clear message
from Labour. This is complex.
All right.
Very clear.
And if anyone would like to see that very moving interview Brianna Jai's mother Esther gave on Sunday on the Laura Kunsberg Show, you can, of course, find it on the BBC iPlayer. The other parts of the questions from Keir Starmer were very much about painting Rishi Sunak as a man who is out of touch. A man who is out of touch, particularly following on from that bet that he made in terms of flights going off to Rwanda. He made it. It was a £1,000 bet with Piers Morgan on his show. And it then went on about non-doms, tax avoidance and so on and so forth. Stephen Flynn, the leader of the SNP at Westminster, picked up on a similar theme. Is it beginning to gain traction? It's difficult to know how important people feel the wealth of the Prime Minister and his family is when it comes to their decisions on who to vote for.
Yeah, I mean, I think this isn't the first time this has come up.
No.
I mean, of course, you can talk about degrees of wealth, and Rishi Sunak is right up there. You know, he's not just rich, he's phenomenally wealthy, as is his wife. But, you know, similar things were said about David Cameron at the time when he was opposition leader trying to get into power, that, you know, you're out of touch if you yourself, as a leader, don't experience the hardships that people have. Now, I think there are ways of deflecting that and of answering that. But I think the problem is, for Rishi Sunak, when you do things things like accept a £1,000 bet, that feeds into those attacks from the opposition. So it's tricky, and of course, cost of living crisis as well being the backdrop to all of this.
Well, let's pick up on that headline, Laura. The Prime Minister, BBC News, Rishi Sunak, claims cost of living pressures starting to ease. What's made him say that?
Well, inflation's going down.
And that's it.
Yeah. No, I mean, that is, what's driving the cost.
Prices are still rising, but they're rising at a bit of slow rate.
The Bank of England's target is for 2%. It's not zero inflation; it's 2%. So yes, we accept that there is a general level of inflation that is for improvements in quality, that type of thing. But
but the
prices are.
But the cost of living crisis, he does admit it's implicit. It is continuing. He thinks it's easing, and you can debate that, but it's continuing. When will it be over?
No, I think that, the general forecasts are that the market expects the inflation to turn to 2% by the end of the year, right? That is a huge achievement considering it was 11%, a year ago. And that hasn't happened by accident. That's because of the work that the government is doing with the bank. And because of that, we're able to start helping people with cost of living by cutting taxes like we did with the national insurance.
Right, but according to a report which you'll know about, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research this week, the living standards of the poorest half of households will be as much as 20% lower this year compared with 2019, 2020, and wouldn't return to pre-pandemic levels until 2027. Do you accept that?
I think that we know that people's living standards have been squeezed, and that's because of high inflation and that leading through to high interest rates from the Bank of England. Right? We know that has had a huge amount of pressure on people. But that's why we put the support that we have that is in place. That's why the Prime Minister has been so focused on bringing down inflation. And we're showing now that the economy is turning a corner, and we don't want to go back to square one with Labour.
Right. Taxes have been cut.
Yes.
National insurance.
Yeah.
There's a debate live and kicking about whether Jeremy Hunt will go further.
Yes.
But in terms of the costs and whether they are affordable or not, how big do we think these tax cuts might be?
Well, look, you wouldn't expect me, Joe, to comment on the budget on your programme. I would get into quite a lot of problem if I did that. But what I would say is that we'll only do things when it's fiscally responsible to do so. You're right that the autumn statement was the biggest tax-cutting event since the 1980s. And we think that's really important because it has been really tough for the last couple of years.
It hasn't,
and
but it continues to be, doesn't it? Because the overall tax burden is still rising because of the freeze on those tax thresholds.
That is an overall figure, yes.
Yeah, it is. The overall figure.
Yeah.
You know, it's pretty staggering. That's the record high figure. It climbs from around 36% to 37% over the course of this
Yes, but Joe, why are those taxes so high? Because we spent £400 billion during COVID, £100 billion for energy prices, and also that's not been even in terms of the way we distributed it. We've asked, people with the broadest shoulders to bear most of the burden.
Right, and Bridget, you will support tax cuts, won't you? Because you've also complained endlessly about the highest tax burden that has been brought in by successive Conservative governments. So you would back tax cuts in the budget?
Well, we didn't back the government when they put up national insurance, and they've put up taxes on working people over 20 times.
So you'll support the tax cuts?
I would like to see working people being asked to contribute less, and I want to see our economy growing. I'm not, in the same way that Laura isn't going to speculate on what her Chancellor might or might not do, we would want to look at precisely what is put forward. But we can trade facts and figures in terms of the state of the economy, the level of inflation. But what are people actually feeling at the moment? Do people feel better off? Do they go to the shops and think, I can spend my money? Yeah. Food price inflation in particular is so high. Yeah. There is such enormous pressure on families. And I think when they hear Rishi Sunak seeking congratulation or praise for the brilliant job he's done, I think they'll think, what planet is this bloke
They might
on?
also want to know what you are actually going to do. If you are supporting tax cuts, listening to you, it sounds like you do support tax cuts, why aren't you advocating instead, as many in your party would like to see, that any extra money goes into public services?
Well, we do want a fairer tax system. That's why we've set out many of the changes around taxation that we would make. So, for example, ending the non-dom tax status, putting that money into more urgent appointments in the NHS. Well, a more fair tax system that makes sure that those who can contribute do so. VAT on private schools, ending the private equity loophole, using that money to fund our public services. There are choices that governments and politicians can make, and the choices that we would make would be focused on those questions of fairness.
Well, let me put a different choice to you, because we had Rebecca Long-Bailey here, sitting in that seat before Prime Minister's questions, and she thinks you should do this. Let's have a listen.
I hope that there are conversations that the party's having now. For example, looking at a wealth tax is one option that Rachel could consider.
Yeah, but she's not.
She's not at the moment, and hopefully...
Oh, you think she might?
Well, possibly. It's my hope, but she might not, but who knows?
Well, is she considering it? Rachel Reeves, sorry, not she. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, would she consider a wealth tax?
No, we're not actively looking at that. I respect Rebecca's right to express her views, but I don't agree.
Right.
Just to be clear, I mean, there are £28 billion of unfunded spending spree, which you are committed
to.
That's
well, hang on.
rubbish.
We'll come to that in a minute.
Your leader literally said yesterday that it was £28 billion is desperately needed. Do you disagree with him? Are you team Rachel Reeves or are you team Starmer?
Laura, this is just, honestly... It's
but
just beneath you. This level of debate is just beneath you.
He said £28 billion was desperately needed. He literally said yesterday.
I know you've come in here with your kind of bits to read out from the Tory attack team.
Sorry, I'm just
repeating what your leader said yesterday. If you want to have a reasonable conversation about this, I'm happy to do so. This is about investing in the long-term prosperity of our country, about the jobs and growth and opportunities.
Is it going to happen? That's the question. It's not just about the rights and the wrongs. Is it actually going to happen?
Our Green Prosperity Plan is central to how we will drive growth, how we will create jobs in every corner of our country and how we as a nation can lead the world. A country has to be at the forefront of this, the new jobs, the new technologies. I'm ambitious for what Britain can achieve. It's just such a shame that over the last 14 years we've had a government that has presided over falling living standards, stagnant wages and an abysmal record on growth. And I will take no lectures from a party that crashed the economy and are forcing millions of people to pay more every month on their mortgage because of the cavalier approach they took under Liz Truss. No lectures on fiscal responsibility from this
economic policy. A basic question about whether you're going to spend £28 billion or not. And then we have the costings, which are today.
I will answer that directly.
Please.
Yes, we will spend up to 28 billion ramped up over the course of the Parliament into the second term, consistent with our fiscal
All right, well, that does sound like a restating of the pledge.
But it has been quite confusing over the last few weeks because quite a lot of your colleagues have refused to even use that figure. It sort of all went quiet for a bit. You can see how voters might be a bit confused about how wedded you are to that.
Oh, was it the answer, just to be clear? So £28 billion consistent with fiscal rules, which is saying that you're not borrowing. So that means taxes.
Right. Is it going to be?
No, it does not. It means it means it will increase over the course of the Parliament, consistent with our fiscal rules. And the nonsense document, the shoddy piece of work that has been published today, which, and I quote, cost the policy, where officials were told to cost the policy without reference to what Labour have said they might spend in any given year, shows just how shoddy and second-rate the work that is being produced on behalf of Tory
let me just, because we need to explain
explain
this to viewers. It came up at Prime Minister's questions. It is a reference to a document from Treasury officials that seemed to throw doubt over the costs of one part of it, particularly, which is the cost of an insulation scheme, which is predicted to be £6 billion. This document apparently says it could be twice that. What is the truth of it?
The point about this is, firstly, about these kind of documents. OK, so these have happened since the 1950s. It's not unusual for Treasury officials to be asked to cost opposition policies. Now, the timing of the release of it is what's caused controversy in the past. In 2019, the then Cabinet Secretary weighed in and said you cannot publish this the night before the election campaign kicks off. So what's happened this time, of course, is that the Conservatives have decided to, I presume, drip this throughout the year. So this is the Warm Home Plan. This is the upgrading of homes to improve their energy efficiency. Now, the document is here and it's suggesting that maybe Labour have got their figures wrong, but at the end you've got additional notes and caveats, and it says here that they're assuming that this is an uncapped promise, that it's fully exchequer funded and an undifferentiated model. But anyway, the point is that Labour have made very clear in their policy document that it is £6 billion that will be spent.
And you have said yet again it will be within the fiscal rules. The question is, are the fiscal rules in the end more important than the borrowing
Yes,
to
the fiscal
invest?
rules will be the driving priority.
All right.
And to be clear, this document does not reflect Labour policy. They've costed someone's policy, but they haven't costed ours.
They have to cost exactly what you've said.
I'm going to leave it there because we're going to look at another area of policy, because you're here as the Shadow Education Secretary, schools policy, because Labour are proposing to end the VAT exemption offered to private schools if they win the next election, which could see parents paying more from private school fees. Exactly why are you doing it, Bridget?
Because I want to prioritise investing in our state schools, and we would use the money raised to create more mental health provision within our secondary schools, guaranteed mental health counsellor in every secondary school, more teachers, I believe our state schools need extra money. I think this is a straightforward question of fairness.
Well, let's talk to Lavina Tandon, who has 2 children in private school. Lavina, welcome to you. Tell us about your situation and what this change in policy if Labour win the election would mean for you.
It's not only me, Joe. There are 95,000 people and counting who have signed this petition who will be affected by this policy, and many more who haven't. So people send their school children to private school for different reasons. It could be special needs. It could be because they want it appeals to their culture and heritage, which is the case in my case. Or they need more challenge, they need more attention. And not all of these people are actually rich, which is what is thought. This policy is going to damage, actually it's counterproductive, and it's going to damage the very people that Ms. Phillipson is trying to actually help, because these are people, and a lot of them are helped by the school. They are on bursary, they are receiving help from friends, family and organizations. And of course, parents who are sacrificing and living a frugal life, working a lot, which all of us do for our children.
Right.
And of course, all of us want great education, but it is only going to price these parents out. And it is going to be a wider class divide and will be for the super rich, exactly what I don't think they want to achieve. So this is not achieving anywhere.
Yeah, you're going to be priced out. But do you think it's fair that private school education, to some extent, is subsidised by the taxpayer?
Yes, because they are also helping. They are helping other people.
All right.
Yes, they're helping through bursaries. There are various other things that they are doing together to help the system. It's not one against the other. It's not pitting one school against the other, Joe. It is about education for all and having choice of education for all.
Let me put those to the Shadow Education Secretary. I mean, Lavina is saying that she and others could be priced out. It'll be the preserve of the super rich, and it is pitting people and families and taking away their choice. Is that what you're doing?
No, I believe in parents having the right to choose where they educate their children, including in the private sector. That won't
taking
change.
away that choice from Lavina.
No, absolutely. Parents can decide where they want their children to be educated. I just believe that we should end the tax breaks that private schools enjoy to prioritise investment in our state schools, where 93% of children, will attend school. That has to be our priority. And I've looked very carefully at the work of the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies, for example, about how much money we could raise through this policy. They estimate to be £1.3 to £1.5 billion net. That's a considerable sum of money we could invest in our state schools. I would also add that private schools have put up their fees year on year, way beyond inflation. I think they could be looking to make some cost savings to avoid parents having that kind of experience as is being described. But let's be clear, the average private school fee in England is over £16,500 per year. That is way beyond the reach of most parents. Most of your viewers, I imagine, their children will be going to school in state schools. They want a government that prioritises investment there.
This policy is popular, according to Ipsos Mori, one set of polls. I think it's about 57%. They think it's fairer.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is one of those ones where, as ever, Labour just don't really have a plan. They haven't thought this through. Obviously, as you're raising the price of something, that is going to have a demand impact. So it's going to put way more pressure on state schools as a result of more people leaving the private sector to go into the state sector. They've not accounted for that. Secondly, they spent the money 7 times, I believe, I've got here, newly qualified teachers, breakfast clubs, more teachers.
That's incorrect, I'm afraid. Breakfast clubs is paid for by the non-dom tax status.
Extracurricular activities, £8,500 mental health workers, post-pandemic catch-up. I mean, they spent this money a lot of times. Maybe not for that individual one.
Your briefing document's evidently wrong.
Let me just go back to Lavina. Let me just go back to Lavina. You want to comment on what you've heard?
Yes. So first of all, IFS themselves have said that these are uncertain figures and this is not uncertain evidence. This is uncertain evidence, and one wouldn't want to base everything on this kind of evidence. That's number one. And number two, taking the point from putting pressure, of course, on school. And in addition to that, some of these schools, if they are also the argument is given, if they would absorb this, then they will shut down. They have said that they will shut down. So you will have additional pressure of these private schools, some of them shutting down, putting more pressure on grammar schools. They have been coming forward and saying that's very difficult to handle. And number three, this can be funded. I'm sorry, I do want to say this very briefly. This can be, we want good state schools, and why can't they be funded from other things, and the oil companies or the bonus,
let me just briefly put the
caps and bonus and whatever else.
Well, Lavina Tangam, I'm so sorry to
schools.
cut you off because we've sort of run out of time, and I just want to get Bridget's response. There is a serious point. If private schools close, where are all those pupils going to go?
So the IFS consider that and don't accept that there will be significant movement. Alongside that, we have a falling birth rate. We're actually in a position at the moment where schools are currently closing. So I don't accept the premise of that, but the IFS did take account of precisely that point and still are clear it will raise a lot of money.
That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.